Welcome to the DePaul College of Law Bluebook Podcast, a series of podcasts designed to teach 1L students the basics of legal citation using the Bluebook. In the last episode, we learned how to form and abbreviate more case names using Bluebook Rule 10.2.1G and H. We reviewed Bluebook's general rules on abbreviations, numerals, and symbols as well. In this episode, we will look at Bluebook's rules for quoting material under Rule 5. You'll want to have a copy of your Bluebook in front of you as you watch this podcast. After watching this podcast, you should be able to complete Bluebook homework number 7 with the help of your Bluebook. Rule 5.1a teaches us how to format quotes of 50 or more words. An abbreviated practitioner's guide to this rule can be found in Blue Pages Rule B12.2. Quotes that are 50 or more words long are known as block quotes. They get this name from their appearance in the text. These quotes should be indented from the normal margin on both the left and the right. Because block quotes are set off from the text by these indents, you would not use quotation marks at the beginning or end of the material. If, however, your block quote contains an internal quote of another authority, you should retain the quote marks around these internal quotations using standard double quote marks. The cite for a block quote appears on the next line after the quote ends. The cite should line up with your main text margin, not the block quote's indented margin. Using a hard return and double-checking your margins should help you realign your text. Take a look at these examples from pages 76 and 77 of the Bluebook, which show how to format longer material, including quotes of multiple paragraphs. First, do double indent the first line of your block quote if the first word in your block quote is the first word of the paragraph in the original. But don't double indent or use ellipsis if you've omitted language from the start of the original paragraph in your block quote. Do use indentation and ellipsis when omitting material at the start of subsequent paragraphs in the same block quote. And do use 4 periods indented on their own line to indicate that you've omitted one or more paragraphs in the middle of your block quote. Quotes of 49 or fewer words are governed by Rules 5.1b and Blue Pages Rule B12.1. Because these quotes will not be set off from your main text like a block, you'll need to use quotation marks to indicate the quoted material. If your quote contains an internal quotation, you should indicate the internal quote with single quote marks. For these shorter quotes, you won't retain paragraph structure from the original, but some material, like dialogue or poetry, has natural paragraph structure or hard line breaks. Therefore, if your quoted material is dialogue or poetry, you should format it as a block quote, regardless of its length. Remember to place periods and commas inside of your quotation marks. Other punctuation will appear outside the quotation marks and only inside the quotation marks if it's in the original. Quotes work best when they're incorporated into your own text and prose seamlessly. In order to make a quote work with your text grammatically, you may need to make slight alterations to the original. Rule 5.2 shows you how to make those alterations. When changing the case of letters from lowercase to uppercase or uppercase to lowercase, enclose the changed letter in a bracket. Similarly, if you need to substitute words or insert material into a quote, enclose such changes in brackets. If, on the other hand, you are omitting letters from a word, indicate the omission with empty bracket at the end of the root word. At times, the original material may include typos, misspellings, or other errors. Significant mistakes in the original can be left as is, with sick in brackets inserted immediately following the error. Be careful with your use of sick, though, as overuse can make you look like a pompous know-it-all. Nevertheless, if repeated errors are part of your theory of the case or a significant fact, including the errors and sicks may be appropriate. Some changes to quoted material should be noted in the citation that follows the quote. If you add emphasis into the original quote, or if you omit internal citation, emphasis, internal quotation marks, or footnote call numbers, you should report those alterations by adding a parenthetical describing the alteration to the end of the citation. You can see examples of such parentheticals on the bottom of page 77 and the top of page 78 in your Bluebook. If you omitted a cite or footnote number that appeared after the last word you quoted, you don't need to indicate it in a parenthetical. You also shouldn't indicate emphasis in the original. Whenever you have internal quotations, you should attribute the internal quote to the original source. Insert such information as a parenthetical at the end of the citation. This form of parenthetical comes after any other parenthetical listed in Rule 5.2. Be sure to format your cites within parentheticals according to the usual rules for formatting citations. In short, be sure to refer to Rule B1 and Rule B12.1 in the blue pages whenever you're trying to cite a quote within a quote. Here's an example of how you would format the citation for a quote within a quote taken from page 78 of the Bluebook. The text uses different colors to show you which text corresponds to each cite. In this example, you have quoted extensively from Marx, which quotes Weissman. Because the primary source you've quoted or relied on is Marx, you would list that as your main cite. The internal quote from Weissman is indicated with the single quote marks in the quote, and the cite is added as a parenthetical at the end. Note that the parenthetical indicating the source of the internal quote appears after the parentheticals indicating that this was from a concurring opinion and indicating that you added emphasis to the quote. An additional example of quotes within quotes can be found on page 27 of the blue pages. When you omit some material from your quote, you need to indicate such omissions according to Rule 5.2, which can be found on pages 78 to 79. In general, use an ellipsis to indicate omitted material. Do not use an ellipsis to begin a quote, or use an ellipsis when words are merely altered. Omitted footnotes or citations are indicated with parentheticals, not ellipsis. And when you weave quoted material into your text, such that you're quoting only a phrase or a clause, you do not need an ellipsis to indicate that you omitted material before or after your quote. You would use an ellipsis, though, if the quote cut words from the middle of the original. On the other hand, when you're using quoted language as a full sentence, follow these conventions. If you omitted material at the start of the quote, do not use an ellipsis, but instead capitalize the first letter of the word you used. Remember to place that letter in brackets. If you omit material in the middle of the sentence, use an ellipsis to indicate the omission. Finally, use an ellipsis to indicate omitted material at the end of an original sentence. Don't forget to include the sentence's punctuation after the ellipsis, as shown here by the underscore. Ellipses are also used to indicate the omission of sentences or clauses in multi-sentence quotations. Where your quote retains a full sentence from the original, but then omits subsequent material before starting up again, indicate that omission by placing an ellipsis after the punctuation from the first sentence. In this example, I've shown you my first sentence was retained in full and ended with a period. I placed 2 spaces after the period according to traditional typesetting conventions, and I inserted my ellipsis. Because I picked up the quote in the middle of the sentence in the original, I've capitalized the first letter of the first word I used and put it in brackets. Finally, if omitting language at the end of a sentence and additional material after that, use only one ellipsis to indicate both omissions. In this first example, note how even though the writer omitted material both at the end of the first sentence and start of the second sentence, the ellipsis was placed before the period indicating the end of the first sentence. Again, the second sentence uses the bracketed E to show the quote is picking up again mid-sentence in the original. This second example may make it easier to see the placement of ellipsis because the original contains a question mark. You've now completed the brief overview of Bluebook's rules for quotations, and you're ready to tackle Bluebook homework number 7. If you have any questions, please see your LARC professor or your TA.